Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I want to talk to you today about history. What aspect of history, I hear you ask? No, I want to talk to you about history. About the way people do history, about the way historians and others construct narratives about the past. Well, to be more accurate, and a little less disingenuous, I want to talk to you about how I approach the past. Firstly, let's get one thing clear. I am not an historian. I realise this might sound a little bit bonkers, as I've now uploaded nearly 3 dozen videos about local history and related subjects, and over the last 30 years written a significant number of books and articles. But none of these are based on what I would think of as historical research, such as sitting in record offices and archives, reading original records, or even the online digitised versions. For that matter, I'm not an archaeologist, geologist, place name researcher, art historian, or even much of a local historian. I suppose on a good day I might just pass muster as an apprentice landscape historian. Yes, I've read the work of all such experts. For much of my life I've read non-fiction books quite voraciously, less so in the last decade. If you've taken much interest in my previous videos, you'll know that I look at maps to see how places are situated in the landscape. I make myself aware of the underlying geology and how this influences the geomorphology, the hydrology, and, by extension, the farming options and practices, which in turn influence where people have lived, initially in dispersed farmsteads and then, from a little over 1,000 years ago, in nucleated villages, which once again spawned dispersed farms after the 18th century enclosure awards. I've read maps since my teenage years, not simply in the sense of being able to follow where I am while walking, cycling, or driving, and looking for the landmarks to identify the correct route, but reading maps in the sense of sitting at a desk, looking at the stories maps begin to tell us. And since older editions of OS maps have been readily available online, then often a real narrative can appear as the successive changes since the 1880s appear on screen, very much like the layers of an onion. I think of places, such as villages, as ever-evolving processes, rather than as something static. But looking at a map is only preparation for visiting places of interest and experiencing the finer nuances of how they are situated in the landscape. And those visits allow a chance to inspect the more historic buildings, such as churches and manor houses. I combine this rather topological approach with a look at the origins of all the place names to see if they shed any light on the history of the settlements and parishes, but I have none of the immense linguistic skills to be a place name researcher. But thankfully, Leicestershire and Rutland benefits from Barry Cox's erudition, a whole working life of intense erudition. By contrast, adjoining counties, such as Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire, have almost nothing to compare. I also have an understanding of archaeology, although I'm not a trained archaeologist and have only limited experience of excavating and field walking. But I have read a great many archaeological reports and books. For over 5 years I lived on the bank of a Neolithic henge in the middle of a World Heritage Site and spent a lot of time simply walking the surrounding landscape, attempting to observe how the different phases of the prehistoric monuments would have once looked when seen from different directions. Interestingly, it was when those walks coincided with dawn or dusk that the insights were greatest. This led to an earlier video, the one on ringed horizons. And at the time I was still living in Avebury, I also wrote several books about the archaeology. But if I don't identify as an historian or an archaeologist, still less with somebody with the skills to be a place names expert, what am I? I think of myself as a researcher. Allow me to provide a very potted autobiography. Research is what I did for a living in my 20s, mostly researching novel plastic processing methods, but also getting involved in pioneering computer-aided testing. Yep, I simply read up on how to write the software, even though my formal training in coding was minimal. I even spent the best part of a year doing an MSc inventing new aluminium alloys, despite the fact I had no prior experience of metallurgy. In my spare time I was reading up on all sorts of aspects of the humanities, including the background for ideas which would much later evolve into these videos. Not until my late 40s, when I gave up these day jobs and became a full-time writer and publisher, was I able to make the time to research in sufficient depth to be able to write books. The first of these was an overview of folklore theory. It was called Explore Folklore. This was followed by an overview of mythology, and under a pseudonym, Simon Dancer, an overview of the social construction of reality, published as The Myths of Reality. And it is this book, The Myths of Reality, which is most relevant to my subsequent research projects. The ideas which underpin the academic authors who created the notion of the social construction of reality also underpinned a movement usually known as postmodernism. And a book written almost simultaneously with The Myths of Reality seems on the surface to be about prehistoric sacred sites. But, to all intents and purposes, it's a book-length case study, which, if not looking at the myths of reality, does look at how we constructed the myth of prehistoric sacred places, and along the way many other myths about idyllic rural life that are now deeply embedded in British culture. How do I approach any such research? Let me give you a few clues. Back in 1992, one of the pioneers of postmodernist archaeology, Michael Shanks, suggested that archaeological investigations should proceed like judicial inquiries. The key point is that every piece of evidence needs to be interrogated and a range of different narratives constructed and challenged as to why the evidence is as it is and where it was found. This is the diametric opposite of having the answer and a grand theory and selecting evidence to support prior assumptions. If this sounds unremarkable, then bear in mind at the time, the late 80s and early 90s, excavating archaeologists all had a grand theory of what it was they were excavating and fitted their finds into that unquestioned theoretical context. These archaeologists had no notion that what they were finding might challenge the prior assumptions. Things have moved on, although in the realms of developer-led and therefore limited budget excavations which dominate archaeology in recent decades, then there simply isn't time for much in the way of sophisticated notions, at least before the post-excavation assessments begin. Frankly, Michael Shanks was just a Johnny-come-lately, as E.H. Carr, in his seminal book called What is History, published in 1961, considered that history is a construct consequent on the questions asked by the historian. But around 1961, British historians generally weren't renowned for their ability to ask interesting questions, and, let it be said, least of all, local historians. There were exceptions. By the 1980s, the list was getting longer. Christopher Hill was the most senior of these pioneers, along with Eric Hobsbawm, who helped set up the academic journal Past and Present in 1952, and E.P. Thompson, most famous for a book called The Making of the English Working Class, which was published in 1963. Alongside these more famous names were a host of lesser lights who contributed to the History Workshop Journal. That was founded in 1976 by Raphael Samuel. In terms of asking curious questions, then Rudyard Kipling got there long before Michael Shanks and E.H. Carr. Back in 1902 he published a poem called I Keep 6 Honest Serving Men. Allow me to quote the opening few lines. I keep 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when, and how and where and who. Kipling's 6 serving men are admirable assistants to a great many human endeavours. In the early 1990s, his quotation was part of a very effective sales training course I attended. And the same course, slightly adapted, also made a very effective management training course. From personal experience since the early 1990s, I can affirm that asking open-ended questions makes great chat-up lines when getting to know new friends and acquaintances, and, more relevant to this video, they have helped me greatly with my historical and archaeological researches. What's so important about questions starting what, why, when, how, where and who? Well, for starters, they don't generate simple yes-no responses. Asking somebody, do you eat breakfast, with the implied answer of yes or no, is a very different question from what do you like to eat for breakfast. And if you can't think of an appropriate question to ask, there's always one very important meta-question to ask yourself. What's excluded from this discussion? Go back a few decades, and in the context of history books, answers are likely to include the perspective of ordinary people, the perspective of women, the perspective of the poor. Yes, things have moved on, sometimes. What is all too often missing from local history is the bigger picture, how a specific village compares or contrasts to other settlements in the vicinity and within a broader regional or national context. Bearing in mind, maybe what is changing, locally or otherwise, is more important than what stays the same. And vice versa. In an earlier video about 3 fonts, I provided an example of how local changes, in this case the commissioning of 3 fonts in the 1630s and the 1660s, reflected both national and international trends. Allow me to repeat an earlier remark. Michael Shanks saying, the key point is that every piece of evidence needs to be interrogated, and a range of different narratives constructed and challenged as to why the evidence is as it is and where it was found. That involves those open-ended questions, Kipling's honest serving men. And it's the key reason why the tagline, or perhaps we should call it the mission statement, of this YouTube channel is, the past as never before. One thing I don't believe is that the past is out there, just waiting to be discovered. For reasons I'll explain in a little more detail, the past is something we construct. Indeed, we continually reconstruct the past, and we construct and reconstruct the past by asking questions. And while all questions are arguably born equal, some questions are way more interesting than others. How do we reconstruct the past? Well, for instance, every major archaeological discovery alters our view of the past. Away from the excavation trenches and inside the supposed ivory towers of academe, a plethora of historical monographs are continually being compiled, each of them offering new ways of thinking about previously well-established events. We see the past with 20/20 hindsight, long after the uncertainties and pluralisms of the time have been resolved into winners and losers, heroes and villains. This is directly analogous to intelligence services seeing clearly, in retrospect, the build-up of terrorist activities prior to an attack, although before the attack the relevant information was only a small part of a vast flow of intelligence, not sufficient to be regarded as significant. We continually reinvent the past. More accurately, we continually recreate our explanations, the causality of the past. Histories are written according to the ideologies of the historian. Marxist historians of the 1970s and 80s wrote very different accounts of the industrialisation of Britain in the 19th century compared to the then established views promulgated by an earlier generation of conservative, upper-middle-class authors likely to be the shareholders in such industries. Black and feminist reclamations of history and archaeology followed, which led in turn to other, sometimes more maverick, readings created from the viewpoint of a wide range of people who consider themselves to be other to the established perspectives. The result has been a wonderfully pluralistic variety of accounts of the past. There is no truth out there for the historian to painstakingly discover. Instead, there's multiple webs of interpretations, each offering quite different connections and giving different meaning and significance. Or as Peter Carroll put it, our common sense strives to create illusory certainty about the causes of events by imputing reverse causal connections. History is bullshit. It is as indeterminate as the future. There's really nothing new about that viewpoint. The words of Samuel Butler may have a quite different idiom, but the underlying insight is not dissimilar. It has been said that though God cannot alter the past, historians can. It is perhaps because they can be useful to him in this respect that he tolerates their existence. George Orwell put it more bluntly, who controls the past controls the future. No prizes for realising that considerable effort is expended on controlling the past through the mass media. Asking curious questions, asking open-ended questions, is only an underlying approach to my research. I read and question, indeed interrogate maps to allow me to construct narratives of how settlements came about as a result of geology, geomorphology, hydrology, successive human activities, and so forth and so forth. Places need to be visited to experience how they fit into the landscape. Questions need to be formulated about why some settlements succeed better than others. This may well engender further questions about the relationship of the successful ones to trade routes. Is there any evidence that the settlements might have helped create such trade routes? In a future video I may share some thoughts as to why places are best thought of as processes. In the meantime, I'll include a link to a free PDF in the remarks below. That PDF gives some idea about how I think about places.